Money Meant for Children. Like, comment, and subscribe, because this story isn't just about stolen money. It's about betrayal in a moment when the country was desperate to believe in help. The sirens cut through the quiet like a warning that came too late. Federal agents moved fast through the Minneapolis neighborhood, black SUVs sliding to a stop in front of a modest office building that looked like 100 others across the Midwest. No marble lobby, no armored gates, just a plain door with a fading sign that promised meals for children during a global crisis. Inside, computers were still on. Spreadsheets glowed on screens. Bank statements lay stacked on desks. And somewhere in those numbers, buried beneath claims of compassion and emergency relief, was a figure so large it almost felt unreal. $250 million. Money meant to feed hungry children during the darkest months of the pandemic. Money that, according to federal investigators, had vanished. The pandemic had created chaos everywhere. Schools closed. Parents lost jobs. Supply chains fractured. And for millions of children, the free meals they depended on simply disappeared overnight. In response, the federal government rushed to expand emergency nutrition programs. Rules were loosened. Funds flowed faster than ever before. The priority was simple: get food to kids now, worry about paperwork later. That urgency became the opening. Across the country, nonprofits sprang up almost overnight. Community groups, cultural organizations, food distribution networks. On paper, they looked like heroes stepping up when the system was overwhelmed. And many of them were. But hidden among them was something else. A web of shell organizations, fake vendors, and inflated claims, each one feeding off the same pipeline of federal money. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of meals claimed per day, millions of dollars requested in reimbursements, all approved at lightning speed, because no one wanted to slow aid during a crisis. At first, the reports blended in. Then an analyst noticed something odd. The meal counts didn't make sense. A small nonprofit was claiming to serve more children than entire school districts. Another reported food deliveries to sites that didn't exist, addresses that led to empty parking lots, closed storefronts, residential homes with no kitchens capable of feeding hundreds. It was dismissed as a data error, until it wasn't. As weeks turned into months, the same names kept appearing. The same vendors billing outrageous amounts for basic supplies. The same bank accounts receiving wire transfers in rapid succession, then moving money offshore or into luxury purchases almost immediately. Cars, real estate, designer goods, all during a time when families stood in food lines, waiting for meals that never came. The investigation quietly escalated. Federal agents began tracing the flow of funds, peeling back layers of companies that existed only on paper. Each time they pulled one thread, it led to another organization, another contract, another signature approving payments that should have raised alarms. But the alarms had been muted by crisis. Behind closed doors, investigators realized they weren't looking at isolated fraud. This was coordinated, organized, and massive. At the center of it were individuals who knew how the system worked, how to exploit emergency rules, how to manufacture legitimacy, how to hide greed behind the language of service. They held press conferences. They posted photos of smiling volunteers. They spoke about equity, culture, and community. And all the while, the money kept flowing. One agent would later describe it as a crime that hid in plain sight. The deeper they dug, the worse it looked. Fake invoices, inflated food prices, children counted multiple times, entire supply chains that never delivered a single meal. And yet, on paper, it all looked flawless, stamped, signed, approved. Until the numbers reached a breaking point. $250 million was no rounding error. That kind of theft left a trail too wide to ignore. The raids came next. Offices, homes, storage units. Investigators seized documents, hard drives, phones. They found evidence of lavish spending that directly overlapped with the receipt of nutrition funds. The contrast was sickening. Bank transfers labeled meal reimbursement followed hours later by purchases that had nothing to do with feeding anyone. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't financial. It was the realization that this fraud thrived because it wrapped itself in moral armor. Anyone who questioned it risked being labeled heartless. Anyone who slowed payments was accused of denying food to children during a crisis. And that shield worked for a long time. As the case began to surface publicly, outrage exploded. Headlines called it the largest child nutrition fraud in U.S. history. Politicians demanded answers. Families demanded accountability. How could something meant to help the most vulnerable be twisted into a personal payday? But even as arrests were announced and charges filed, one question refused to go away. How did this get so big without anyone stopping it? Because buried in the documents was a detail investigators couldn't ignore. Early warnings had been raised. Emails sent. Concerns flagged. Red flags noted. And somehow, nothing changed. Which meant this story wasn't just about criminals stealing during a pandemic. It was about a system that looked the other way. And when investigators finally opened a seized laptop tied to one of the key players, they didn't just find financial records. They found messages suggesting the fraud wasn't hidden at all. It was expected. And what those messages revealed would change the case from a scandal into something far more unsettling. In the chaos of a global crisis, a door was opened. A floodgate of federal funds designed to feed hungry children during a pandemic. But once that door was open, it refused to close. What started as a mission of mercy became a blueprint for one of the most audacious fraud schemes in recent memory. Federal investigators began their work sifting through spreadsheets, tracking numbers that seemed too large to be real. But soon, those numbers led to names, and the names formed a network. This wasn't just a few opportunists taking advantage of a crisis. It was a carefully constructed ecosystem where nonprofits, vendors, and intermediaries colluded, creating the illusion that millions of meals were being served to children in need. The entire operation was built on a foundation of paperwork. The claims were immaculate. Thousands of meals reported, day after day. Receipts were perfectly matched, dates aligned, and digital signatures looked authentic. During the pandemic, government agencies were urged to prioritize speed over scrutiny, to get aid out as quickly as possible. And so, the approvals rolled through, almost automatically. But behind the pristine paperwork, the reality was starkly different. When investigators made unannounced visits to the listed meal sites, they found a phantom operation. Some addresses led to abandoned buildings. Others were empty storefronts that had never handled food. A few were just residential homes, where confused neighbors said they'd never seen a single food delivery, let alone thousands of meals a day. At one site, an agent stood in an empty, windswept parking lot. The only thing there was a sign, still bolted to a fence, that read, "Free meals for kids." According to the records, this location alone had claimed millions of dollars in reimbursements. There was no kitchen, no staff, no children. The hunger was real, but the meals were a lie. The money, however, was very real. Bank records painted a damning picture. Federal funds flowed into the accounts of these so-called nonprofits, then rushed out just as quickly. The money was laundered through a maze of shell companies posing as vendors. It was disguised as consulting fees, transportation costs, and storage expenses. Each transaction added another layer of fake legitimacy while skimming more cash from the top. It was a closed loop. The vendors were often connected by family ties, shared business addresses, or overlapping board members. Money went in, cycled through a series of friendly entities, and came out clean enough to spend. And spend they did. While food banks were overwhelmed and families struggled, the architects of this scheme were living lavishly. Investigators traced the stolen funds to luxury homes purchased during lockdowns, high-end cars bought with cash, and perfectly timed overseas transfers made just after government reimbursements landed. In one staggering case, a single nonprofit received tens of millions of dollars, then wired huge sums to accounts abroad within days. The justifications were always vague: operational costs, emergency expansion, cultural outreach. But the real story was in the luxury goods and extravagant lifestyles. When agents executed search warrants, the contrast was sickening. They found boxes labeled children's meals sitting unopened, right next to brand new designer handbags. Safes stuffed with cash were hidden behind banners promoting community service. And on seized hard drives, they found the criminals' own words. Internal chats revealed a casual, almost mocking confidence. They spoke openly about how approvals were automatic, how oversight was asleep, and debated how much they could steal before anyone would notice. But someone did notice. Buried deep in the case files was a series of emails from a state-level official sent months earlier. This official had grown uneasy. The numbers were too big, the growth too fast. The documentation felt too perfect. They raised the alarm. The response they received was swift and dismissive. The official was warned about slowing down aid during a crisis, about the optics of questioning organizations serving marginalized communities, about the political cost of being wrong. The warnings worked. The official went silent, and that silence would later become a critical piece of the investigation. As indictments loomed, the pressure mounted. Some suspects began to cooperate. Others hired high-powered attorneys and prepared to fight. A few simply disappeared from public view, hiding behind legal walls built with the very money they were accused of stealing. One mid-level participant who chose to cooperate described the scheme as open knowledge in certain circles. They explained that if you had the right contacts, you could set up a nonprofit, partner with pre-approved vendors, and start billing the government almost immediately. Audits were rare, and site visits, if they happened at all, were announced in advance. Every question had a buzzword-filled answer. Everyone just assumed someone else was doing the checking. In the end, no one was. The public reaction was explosive. Parents who had relied on food assistance during the pandemic were outraged. How could millions be stolen while their children went hungry? Advocacy groups called it a betrayal of trust on an unprecedented scale. Lawmakers promised reform, oversight, and accountability. But behind the scenes, investigators uncovered something even more troubling. The fraud had continued even after red flags were raised internally. Payments were still approved. Claims were still processed. The machine, it seemed, was designed to keep moving no matter what. This wasn't just a story of criminal ingenuity. It was a story of systemic, institutional failure. As the trial dates approached, the narrative began to shift. Defense attorneys argued that the rules were unclear, that government guidance changed daily, that in the chaos of the pandemic, mistakes were inevitable. They tried to paint their clients as patriots who stepped up in a time of need, only to be punished by the very government that created the chaotic conditions. Prosecutors fought back, presenting a mountain of evidence showing clear intent, incriminating messages, financial transfers, and patterns of behavior too consistent to be accidental. And then came the twist. Among the seized communications, investigators found evidence that at least one organization had warned others to slow down. Not because they were afraid of getting caught, and not because they felt guilty. They were worried that the sheer scale of the theft was becoming too visible. Their concern wasn't about the legality of their actions. It was about exposure. This single revelation changed everything. This wasn't about desperation or confusion. It was a calculated, criminal enterprise, moderated only by the fear of attracting too much attention. As the case barrels toward the courtroom, investigators know that the full scope of the theft may never be known. The money is scattered, spent, and moved beyond reach. The children who were supposed to receive these meals will never see a penny of it. And at the center of the wreckage is a system that trusted too easily, questioned too late, and is now forced to face a reckoning far larger than any single defendant. Because the question is no longer just about who stole the money. It's about all the people who knew what was happening and chose to look the other way. Thanks for watching. If you found this investigation important, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that matter. By the time dawn broke over Minneapolis, the investigation had stopped feeling like a fraud case and started feeling like a manhunt. Federal agents moved quietly, aware now that the people behind the $250 million theft weren't just stealing money. They were erasing trails, silencing insiders, and preparing exits. What began as falsified meal counts had escalated into something far more dangerous. A coordinated operation with layers of shell companies, political protection, and international money movement. Inside a secured conference room, agents pinned new evidence to the board. Wire transfers traced through Nevada, Cyprus, and finally Dubai. Luxury real estate purchased under relatives' names. Supercars registered to nonprofit consultants. The numbers were staggering, but what chilled investigators most was how close the criminals had come to getting away with it. Until one mistake. The mistake wasn't financial. It was human. A mid-level accountant, someone who had processed invoices for months without asking questions, had tried to quietly leave the country. Airport security flagged the ticket because it had been purchased with a nonprofit credit card that should have been frozen weeks earlier. That single transaction reopened a door the conspirators thought was sealed. Under questioning, the accountant broke. Not dramatically, not with tears, just exhaustion. He explained how meal sites existed only on paper. how spreadsheets were copied and slightly altered each month to avoid detection, how inspectors were tipped off in advance or never sent at all. Most devastating of all, he revealed the name everyone feared but couldn't yet prove. The architect, not a frontline nonprofit director, not a community organizer, but a behind-the-scenes strategist who never signed documents, never appeared on public records, and never attended meetings without a lawyer present. He controlled the flow of money through intermediaries, promising protection in exchange for loyalty. And he was already preparing to disappear. Agents moved fast. Federal warrants were issued within hours. Homes were raided before sunrise. Storage units were opened. Hard drives seized. In one downtown condo, investigators found stacks of prepaid phones, foreign passports, and a handwritten ledger, old school, meticulous, and devastating. The ledger didn't just list numbers. It listed names, nonprofit executives, vendors, consultants, even a few local officials who had ignored warnings in exchange for donations or favors. The case was no longer just about stolen funds. It was about betrayal on an institutional scale. When the alleged architect was finally detained, it wasn't during a dramatic chase. It was at a private air terminal, moments before boarding a chartered jet. Calm, well-dressed, confident, he reportedly smiled when agents approached. That smile didn't last long. In court, the narrative unraveled piece by piece. Prosecutors laid out timelines showing how, during the height of the pandemic, when families stood in food lines and schools struggled to feed children, this network had inflated numbers, forged reports, and drained public funds meant for the most vulnerable. Defense attorneys argued mismanagement, mistakes, cultural misunderstandings, but the evidence was relentless. Emails coordinating cover stories, messages mocking auditors, photos of luxury vacations taken during the same weeks nonprofits claimed to be operating at full capacity. The most haunting moment came during sentencing arguments, when a federal investigator read a simple statement into the record. This money was meant to feed children. Instead, it fed greed. Convictions followed. Long sentences, asset forfeitures, properties seized, cars auctioned. The illusion of untouchability collapsed in real time. And yet, when the dust settled, one question lingered. Where did all the money go? Despite the seizures, more than $60 million remained unaccounted for, traced offshore, then lost in a maze of accounts beyond immediate reach. Prosecutors admitted it quietly. Some of the money might never come back. Communities felt that loss. Programs shut down. Trust evaporated. Families who had relied on those meals were left wondering how something meant to protect them had been weaponized against them. The case became a warning taught in federal training rooms and ethics seminars. A reminder that the most dangerous crimes don't always involve guns or masks, but paperwork, silence, and opportunity. Years later, one investigator summarized it best. They didn't just steal money. They stole faith in the system. And somewhere, in a country with strict banking secrecy, an account still sits untouched, waiting. If this story pulled you in, disturbed you, or made you question how deep corruption can really go, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe. Stay sharp. The truth doesn't stop here.